Picture this. You're walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD. Marble columns gleam under the midday sun. The scent of incense and roasted meat wafts through the air. But then, a chilling sight stops you cold. The Emperor Nero himself, cloaked in imperial purple and basking in the adoration of the people, is strolling proudly through the forum with what appears to be his new wife. A striking young woman, radiant in robes of silk and glittering jewels, but whispers ripple through the crowd, because behind the beauty lies a sinister truth. That woman, beside the most powerful man in the world, was once a boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to him is considered one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical abuse in recorded history. Before we journey into these forgotten tales of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, please consider liking this video and hitting that subscribe button for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. You can still hear the clatter of sandals on cobblestones, the humming of street vendors, the sudden laughter of children playing near the fountains, but there is something else in the air too, a rot. Not from the Tiber, but from power. Absolute, unrestrained, festering power. And it is here, in the shadow of palaces gilded with gold and blood, that a boy named Sporus begins to vanish. We do not know his original name. His history begins not in triumph or destiny, but in erasure. Sporus was likely born into servitude or the lower ranks of the imperial household, a beautiful child marked from the beginning by his androgyny. Ancient Roman historians, like Cassius Dio and Suetonius, do not dwell on his origins. They were far more interested in what he became, or rather, what Nero made of him. But if we are to understand the true horror, we must start with the institution that consumed him. Rome was a machine, and children within its imperial orbit were often reduced to tools. Eunuchs, pages, and pleasure slaves were bred for silence and obedience. The concept of consent did not exist for them. To be chosen by the emperor was not an honor, it was a sentence, and Sporus was selected with cold precision. He was around 12, maybe 13. The sources are not precise, because the details were considered unworthy of record. But we know this. Nero was searching for a replacement. His previous wife, Poppaea Sabina, had died at his own hands. He kicked her to death in a fit of rage while she was pregnant. He grieved her with manic intensity, veering from inconsolable sobs to desperate reenactments. And then he saw Sporus. To understand what came next, you must feel it. Imagine being led through polished marble corridors by torchlight. The air is dry, your skin prickling under your tunic as the temperature cools deeper into the palace. Whispers echo along the walls. You smell perfume, too sweet, cloying. And then a hand touches your shoulder. A voice tells you the emperor wants you. It was not a request, and it was not a choice. According to Cassius Dio, Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated, not by a physician in some sanitized chamber, but as part of a brutal transformation into what the emperor imagined as the perfect woman. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, just a knife, screaming, and the iron will of the most powerful man in the world. The boy would never become a man, his voice would never drop. His body would never follow its natural course. From that moment on, his identity was decided for him. He would become the Empress. In public, Nero lavished Sporus with jewels, silk gowns, and the title, of Augusta traditionally reserved for the emperor's lawful wife. He was paraded beside Nero in chariots, guarded by praetorians, displayed like a living doll. He was forced to enact rituals of marriage and femininity. The emperor even staged a mock wedding. Tacitus tells us this with barely disguised contempt. The wedding was public, the veil and dowry displayed. Guests were summoned, Rome watched. But what they saw was not a celebration. It was the burial of a child's identity. The transformation was not just physical, it was psychological. Every day, Sporus was required to perform womanhood in the image of Nero's fantasy, to dress, speak, and move in a way that fed his delusion that Poppaea had returned. And if he failed, if he hesitated, or resisted, he would have been beaten, starved, humiliated. There is no direct record of every strike or scream, but we can infer it through the silence. Victims often disappear from the sources, not because they are unimportant, but because their pain was constant. Unremarkable, expected. We must understand that this was not a one-time atrocity. It was a daily existence. Sporus was made into a mirror, and Nero looked into him and saw only what he wanted to see. That is the cruelest violence. To be denied even your own reflection. Meanwhile, the city murmured. Whispers rippled through the Senate and the streets alike. They called Sporus the boy woman. They compared him to past scandals and joked bitterly about Nero's madness. But none of them intervened. Power does not tolerate interference. And so the boy continued to smile when ordered, to bow when summoned, to walk hand in hand with the man who had mutilated him. And yet, even as he wore the jewelry of queens, Sporus remained a prisoner. He slept in golden rooms behind locked doors. He ate food prepared by slaves who dared not meet his eyes. Every pleasure was poisoned. Every gesture of affection was a reminder of who held the leash. But there was no escape. Not yet. Years passed, and the empire darkened further. Nero descended into paranoia, executing senators, poets, even his own mother. Rome burned, and he blamed the Christians. The cruelty that had devoured Sporus began to spread like smoke through every corridor of Roman power. But still, he remained at Nero's side, ever the phantom bride, ever the silent witness. And, as Sporus matured, something else began to happen. He learned the choreography. He internalized the cues. He became the thing Nero demanded, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only way to survive. This is the beginning of the tragedy. Not the blood, not the blade, but the slow, excruciating death of agency, when even your coping becomes complicity. But as cracks began to spread through Nero's rule, the illusion began to decay. Rome's laughter turned bitter, and even Nero's closest allies started to withdraw behind veiled expressions. The emperor no longer walked through the forum with triumphant arrogance. His eyes darted constantly, paranoia blooming like rot in his chest. And yet, through it all, Sporus still walked beside him. At first glance, you might have thought he had accepted his place. He wore his silks with practiced elegance. His voice, high and controlled, responded gently when summoned. He bowed. He smiled. He kissed Nero's ring. But inside, he was disintegrating. By this time, Sporus had learned how to survive inside a nightmare. You had to vanish, even as you existed. You had to detach from the self that was screaming inside your skull. You had to become air. He was no longer a boy, but not a man. Not a woman, yet not allowed to be anything else. He had been assigned a gender, a name, a role, and none of it belonged to him. The only thing that remained his was the suffering. We know little of his inner voice. But trauma speaks through silence. The way Roman sources describe Sporus without agency, without actionize itself, a reflection of the damage done. He had become so completely rewritten that even historians wrote about him as if he were an object. Tacitus, Suetonius, Diothe describe him as the eunuch Sporus, Nero's bride, a grotesque mimicry. They never ask how he felt, but we must. Imagine the mind of a teenager, forced into marital rituals with the man who mutilated you, publicly kissed, paraded in theatrical performances. One such display saw Nero dressing as a bride himself, and Sporus, the wife, cowering as the emperor played the groom in a parody of union. They laughed. The court cheered. But you would have wanted to vanish into the stone beneath your feet. Every act of affection was a performance for a watching crowd, and failure meant punishment. To refuse would have meant death. But compliance was its own kind of dying. To understand the depth of his isolation, we must look at the Roman court. It was a place of shifting alliances and silent terror. Sporus would have been surrounded by slaves, guards, flatterers, and sycophants. None could be trusted. Every word risked betrayal. Every glance could be reported. His only company, day and night, was the man who had destroyed him. And yet, something else took root in Sporus during this time. Not resistance, not exactly. That would have been suicidal, but a kind of watching. A quiet calculation. When Nero began to unravel, so did the strict choreography of his madness. As the emperor began to lose his grip on power, Sporus began to understand that even gods could bleed. One moment stands out. Nero was scheduled to appear before the Senate to defend himself against accusations of treason. But instead, he broke down. He wept. He screamed. He collapsed onto the floor, crying for mercy, babbling about how he deserved a proper burial. Sporus was there. He watched this titan shrink into a child. The tables had not turned, but they had begun to shift. What had once been a golden cage now shook with uncertainty. Nero's enemies multiplied. The governors of Gaul and Hispania rose against him. His imperial guard abandoned him. And at last, the Senate declared him a public enemy. Still, Nero clung to Sporus. Even in the final days, as the emperor fled through darkened villas outside the city, sleeping in slave quarters and dressing in disguises to avoid recognition, Sporus remained by his side. Nero no longer cared about appearances. His imperial robes were replaced with rags. His hands trembled. His breath smelled sour and hot with panic. But he still kept Sporus close, as if he were a living relic of his lost grandeur. Or, perhaps as some historians believe, because Sporus had become a kind of twisted comfort, the last remaining part of the world Nero had dominated. Sporus, trapped in this downward spiral, did not run. He couldn't. Escape was nearly impossible. Even in the emperor's decline, power still clung to Nero like tar. His soldiers might have deserted him, but they would still kill at his command. And besides, where could Sporus go? Who would protect a eunuch who had once lived as the emperor's mock wife? He was not a man in Roman eyes, not a citizen, not a free person. He was property, damaged property. And yet, this proximity gave him something he had never had before, a front-row seat to the collapse of the man who had tormented him. We must pause here to feel the weight of this. Sporus had suffered one of the most grotesque violations imaginable. He had been mutilated, dressed, renamed, displayed, and repeatedly humiliated. But now, here he was, watching the gods fall. That moment matters, because for the first time, he was not the one being broken. Nero's death came not by sword, but by cowardice. Surrounded, betrayed, and too afraid to face execution, he fled to the villa of his freedman, Phaon. There he paced for hours, weeping, muttering about art, fame, and oblivion. And beside him, always beside him, was Sporus. It is reported that Nero begged those around him to kill him. None would. So he finally took the blade himself, but not before asking Sporus to sing for him. Yes, to sing. Imagine standing in that room, the air choked with the stink of sweat and fear, Nero trembling, a dagger clutched in hand, and he turns to you, his broken toy, and says, "Sing to me, soothe me, be my comfort." Sporus sang. We don't know what song he chose. Perhaps something from the stage. Nero loved the theatre. Or perhaps something he remembered from before, from the days before everything was taken. But the words would have shaken with grief, with hate, with memory. And as he sang, Nero plunged the blade into his own throat. Blood sprayed. His hands clawed at the wound. Gurgled breath spilled out across the floor. It was over. You might expect that this would be Sporus's freedom, that with the death of the emperor, he could at last reclaim some piece of himself. But history is not a story of justice. It is a story of systems. And systems do not die with one man. To understand what happened next, we must look at what Rome did with its broken survivors. In the chaotic reshuffling of power that followed Nero's suicide, Sporus became something worse than forgotten. He became a trophy, a ghost still wrapped in silk. It did not take long before a new man, Nymphidius Sabinuste, ambitious Praetorian prefect, who had once betrayed, Nero claimed him, not with kindness, not with pity, but as a prize of conquest. This man, Nymphidius, had styled himself as the next ruler of Rome, and like Nero before him, he saw in Sporus not a person, but a performance, another emperor, another nightmare. Sabinus paraded Sporus publicly, just as Nero had. He too staged a mock wedding, with Sporus once again forced to play the part of imperial bride. There was no rescue in regime change. The knife had simply changed hands. By now, the boy who had once flinched in palace corridors had grown into a young man. But still he was caged. And though the robes grew heavier with embroidery, they could no longer mask the weight of what had been done to him. His body was no longer his own. His name had been replaced. His voice remained high, soft, an echo of that night under Nero's roof. And the people who surrounded him, they were the same type of men, hungry, boastful, dead behind the eyes. He had survived Nero only to be recycled into another man's fantasy. The cycle of possession had not ended. But Nymphidius was not Nero. He lacked the charisma, the theatrical instinct, the sheer hypnotic dominance that had kept Rome under spell. His bid for power collapsed almost immediately. When the Senate refused to name him emperor, his own guards turned against him. He was cut down in the street, beaten and butchered, and once again Sporus was left alive in the wreckage of a dead man's dreams. This time it was Nero's former ally, and briefly the emperor of Rome who took him. The historian Suetonius tells us plainly, Otho kept Sporus in the same way Nero had, no elaboration, because by now no elaboration was necessary. Sporus's story had become a known shorthand for degradation. You are passed from hand to hand, each one colder than the last. Your body, a stage, your silence, a contract. There is no justice waiting, no tribunal, no cleansing moment of recognition. The world will not turn to you and say, "We're sorry." It will hand you a new veil and tell you to smile. And somewhere in the dim corners of a new palace, Sporus broke. The final chapter of his life is recorded in fragments. But what remains is this. Under the reign of Emperor Vitellius, Sporus was scheduled to be publicly raped to death. That sentence must be said exactly as it is, not softened, not interpreted. Vitellius, known for grotesque appetites and sadistic games, intended to stage a gladiatorial spectacle in which Sporus would be violated and killed in front of an audience. It was to be punishment, entertainment. A spectacle meant to mock Nero's memory by desecrating his former wife. Sporus, now likely in his late teens or early 20s, understood what was coming, and he chose death. Before the spectacle could be carried out, he took his own life. Some sources suggest poison, others say he stabbed himself. The method is less important than the meaning. He had been forced to play every role bride, queen, ghost, but this one he claimed for himself. For the first time, he chose the ending. We must let that settle in us. This was a boy mutilated, re-identified, raped and paraded by 3 successive rulers. Not once did he regain freedom. Not once was he seen for who he had been before they took his name. He was consumed, not by accident, but by design. And the world did not mourn him. His name became a punchline. Roman writers referred to him with scorn or ridicule. Dio called the whole ordeal Nero's foulest joke. Sporus himself was rarely granted a sentence without mockery. He was not remembered as a human being, but as a symptom of decadence. But we must remember him differently. Sporus was not a symbol of imperial excess. He was a child born into a world that weaponized bodies, that flattened identity, that turned trauma into theatre. He survived longer than many would have. He adapted, endured, observed, but survival in such a world is not proof of consent. It is proof of what people can endure when all other options are stolen. What Sporus endured tells us not only about Rome, but about the systems we still live within. Systems that consume the vulnerable, that assign roles to people without their choosing, that turn suffering into entertainment, and then forget the name of the sufferer. Even now, his story echoes in places where the powerless are dressed and displayed, where gender is imposed, where trauma is made invisible because it makes us uncomfortable to see it. And so we say his name again. Sporus. Not as a joke, not as a relic, but as a reminder of what cruelty looks like when it wears the mask of love, when it parades as power, when it laughs as it destroys. May we never forget.